Okay. David Cashone, the pride of Erie, Pennsylvania. Uh, Something that few of you will remember, but which is a point of pride with a number of us. Dave chaired the 1959 cane spree for our class, which we won for the second year in a row. And it's rare that a class wins it 2 years in a row, but we did. And so Dave gets kudos for that. He was a geology major at Princeton, a proud member of Quadrangle Club. He lived in the Taj Mahal over in Blair. And then after Princeton, became an ensign in the United States Navy, retired as a lieutenant commander after gaining his PhD in oceanography from MIT/Woods Hole. And he was the United States Geological Service for 23 years and wrote and published a number of papers. Dave's topic today is submarines and submersibles, diving for science and national security. And with no further ado, I give you our wonderful classmate, Dave Cashone.
Okay. Hi, guys. I'm really glad to be here and see many familiar faces. I've tried to make most of the other meetings, and I sure am honored to be here. Thanks, Tom and Bob, for that introduction. And Joe, I hope you get better, Joe Caltagirone. I'm going to try to get my slides on, and I'm going to try to follow what Tom taught me here. And I'm not a very good. And I added curiosity because that was sort of what drove me originally. And I'm going to talk today about my experiences on the seafloor, pretty up close and personal. And it was inside a couple of deep diving submergence vehicles. And the dives all took place a long time ago. As we all know, it's about a half a lifetime ago in the 70s and 80s, as all of us 80-year-olds know. And I'm going to mainly dwell on three of these deep diving vehicles. The first one, maybe the longest part of my talk, is about the Navy's really unusual and amazing nuclear-powered research submarine called NR-1, which most people don't know about, never heard of. And I gave this talk to a bunch of military officers up here in Vancouver, Washington, and Portland, Oregon, and almost all of them never heard of NR-1. It was a highly classified Navy submarine I'll talk about. And then I'm going to also mention my experiences with the deep submergence vehicles, the DSV's Elvin and its twin Seacliff. There is another, actually a triplet turtle that I'll talk about. But I want to start by, first of all, I want to give a tribute and give this talk in honor of a good friend and colleague and classmate, John Ogden, who passed away unexpectedly recently while having surgery on his hip. John was a great guy, and many of you saw him and heard him give a talk about coral reefs. And he and I, both oceanographers, often talked. I got my interest in the ocean floor probably starting back. Growing up in Erie, Pennsylvania, it was on Lake Erie. I didn't know much about the ocean. But I went to Princeton and studied there under one of my professors, Harry Hess, who was actually the chairman of the geology department back then. And he was involved in pushing a theory that he and a few other folks had, the theory of seafloor spreading. And he taught that in his advanced general geology class, which I took in actually 1961. And here's Harry on the left here talking about this idea of how the ocean floor was being formed in the middle of the ocean rises, and the new seafloor was pushing on the continents, and they were drifting around. Hess is also shown in the lower right as a Navy officer on a support ship that he had during World War II. And when he crossed the Pacific many times, he left his echo sounder on. And because of that, he discovered these flat-topped undersea mountains that were deeper than 200 meters and down deep as 4,000 meters. And it was hard to explain these volcanic flat-top mountains. And Hess proposed that they were once above the seafloor, And these volcanic mountains had been eroded by wave activity, and then corals grew on top and flattened them out. And then they sank because of this idea of seafloor spreading. And that all got me pretty interested in the oceans. And then when the draft board came calling, I immediately ran off to Naval Officer School with a couple of our classmates and became an ensign in the Navy in 1962 in December. And there's the ocean floor that I worked on for the most part of my life since leaving Princeton. And you can see that wonderful mid-Atlantic ocean ridge running up the Atlantic. It's all submerged except for a couple of volcanic islands that stick up. And it runs up into Iceland. Iceland is part of the mid-Atlantic ridge. That's why Iceland remains quite active as part of the Earth's surface. And I'll mention Iceland again as I go on. So that's around 69, 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean water. And it certainly has been a great place to study and focus. So my first dive was in this very secret Navy nuclear-powered submarine called NR-1. It was launched in 1969 out of Groton, Connecticut. It never belonged to any particular submarine force. It was launched as just a unique, one-of-a-kind submarine under its brainchild of Admiral Rickover. And I'll go into that in a minute. And then it was put out of commission about 15 years ago, a little less, in 2009. And it wasn't too unlike a submarine we've all heard about, maybe read about, by Jules Verne in 1870 in the lower right. The submarine Nautilus, and in that wonderful book and then movie, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Captain Nemo roaming around the oceans for 20,000 leagues. That's not water depth. That would be certainly deeper than the Earth. But it's about 60,000 nautical miles of traveling in the oceans. Certainly NR-1 didn't do that, but NR-1 is a little bit similar to the Nautilus in many ways, I'll mention. There it is being launched on the left in 1969, and there's the janitor of this amazing vehicle. Admiral Rickover, he was basically the father of the nuclear power Navy that we have. And he had this idea that there ought to be a few submarines built that could explore the bottom of the ocean to help with understanding what the oceans were all about, but also to see about how we can use the ocean to protect our country by putting down listening stations and other things like that, which came about right after this 1969. He was a pretty amazing guy. I got my dives because I was a Navy lieutenant up in the Office of Naval Research in Boston when it existed. I was the oceanographer there, and Admiral Rickover got a hold of me and wanted me to start doing some research or encourage research using this new submarine that he had built. And he called me to Washington and we talked about it. It was a pretty uncomfortable meeting I had with him. But I agreed and, of course, saluted and marched off to do my dives. And so I began diving in early 1970s after I left my PhD program at MIT. The NR-1 had a nickname. They called it Nerwin. It was only 145 feet long. And of that 145 feet, only 96 feet were actual pressure hull. It was a steel pressure hull, and it had a beam of only 12 feet. And as you'll see, it was much narrower in the living area. And the propulsion was turboelectric, and it drove two main propellers that it had off the stern. And then they also had two forward and aft maneuvering thrusters that could be cause NR-1 to turn on its own axis. It was powered by the turboelectric drive was powered by a mini fairly new pressurized water nuclear reactor that Rickover sort of treated as his pet reactor. The speed of NR1 didn't break any records, but it was 5 knots on the surface and 4 knots submerged. And a knot, of course, is a nautical mile per hour. And it had an endurance, as you see, of 25 days. But typically, because of the limitations on the air and cleaning the atmosphere inside, carbon dioxide and monoxide, had a limitation of about 10 days with the full operating crew. The crew consisted of 3 officers, sometimes just 2, 8 crewmen, and 2 scientists. The officers and crew were fully nuclear power trained, and any one of them could have run this NR1 by themselves, whether an enlisted or officer. Now, the operating depth exceeded anything that submarines had in the early 1970s, and that was 1,000 meters, roughly 3,000 feet. This is unfortunately the only schematic I had of the submarine, and as you can see, there's a cylindrical inside pressure hull where the turbo generator and the mini nuclear reactor were, and the little engineering space. This was about 95 feet, and then there was a small space forward of the lead shielding material for the operations and of the submarine. And in the operations area, there were only 4 bunks for all those people. And so there was a lot of what we call in the Navy hot bunking, not sleeping together, but when one guy got up, another person went in. And then up here was the control station, and it had 3 viewports where you could look at the bottom, and I'll show those in a minute. And it had a little area where you could eat and sort of keep materials. And we ate out of a sort of a early microwave oven. It was a convection oven that the old P-3 Navy aircraft used to have. And you ate whatever they served. And it wasn't, there were things like, TV meals and Eggo waffles, things like that. NR1 had a conning tower here with 2 hatches, and in order to protect people on the inside. And then it had the thrusters up forward, and down below in the sort of free flooded keel space outside the pressure hull were these variable ballast tanks that allowed it to go up and down in the water. And up on the conning tower, there were these diving planes that could be turned to put the submarine up or down. It's quite a thing. Oh, it had these black boxes here, are on forward and aft, are lead shot that could be released if the submarine had to surface in a hurry, which fortunately never did while I was on board. This is another schematic just to show you another way of looking at it. But the reactor and the turboelectric drive were in here, and it had 2 propellers. And then the bunks are here in the area of controlling the submarine here. And then it had a large arm that could either cut or pick up materials from the seafloor. And inside the free flooded outside keel area, it had a elevator that could be raised and lowered, so that a work module that you could put materials picked up by the arm into the module and taken back for study. This is looking, I took this picture looking forward at the conning station in NR1, and as you can see, it's not very wide, and 11 people roaming around in this little space. Got pretty old at about the 10th day. And you can see, I'll mention a little more about the control area as we go on. Off on the left here were scientific equipment, including a recorder that measured the bottom depth, an echo sounder type device. It also had a recorder that had a seismic penetrating device called the 3.5 kilohertz echo sounder that actually could penetrate the bottom sediment and find the hard rock below. And then it had a side scanning sonar. This is back in the 1960s. but the side scanning sonar could actually scan out to the side to see any objects that were on the seafloor or the shape of the floor or some unusual rock formation. This is looking forward. The OOD is the officer of the deck here on the left, and the helmsman here, another officer on the right, and he's actually pointing to a screen that has a obstacle avoidance sonar that he could look at to see if there's anything in the way of driving the submarine. Remember, we don't, when you're inside here, you need something to look out, and you had a sonar and videos. They had an outside video camera to look at to see if we're going to hit a rock. This is, again, the command and control, and I marked down here the periscope video. There was a video mounted on the periscope outside top the submarine. And here's one of these high-resolution sonars. And off on the left is another scientific device to look at the bottom. And here, where I spent a lot of time, underneath the OOD and helmsman, you crawled under there, and there were 3 viewports, 6-inch acrylic glass, where you could look through or take pictures from. The submarine had plenty of cameras, both video, 16 and 8 millimeter and 35 millimeter cameras mounted outside, which we took a lot of pictures. There were all sorts of lights, incandescent lights and thallium iodide lights outside the submarine. Now, someone's always asking me about, well, what did you breathe down there? Well, we breathed oxygen, but the oxygen had to be created, and we didn't have those fancy oxygen tanks at the time or oxygen manufacturing systems. So what we had were chlorate candles, these sodium chlorate candles that we basically burned at a high temperature in a special oven, and they generated oxygen. And so we had an oxygen limitation by how many candles were on board, and that basically limited the operations to that roughly 10 days. And we also had to scrub the carbon monoxide and the hydrogen and also the carbon dioxide from the air. And there were different ways of doing this. The carbon dioxide was removed by a lithium hydroxide canister chemical reaction. Communications, we had a wire on a float that would go to the surface, and we could actually use a radio, HF radio, to communicate. But the HF radio often didn't work because the wire sometimes parted or the float didn't get the wire to the surface. So it was pretty intermittent. And we had an underwater telephone that didn't work very well because it was often in a submarine canyon. NR1, making only 5 knots, you couldn't go very fast and go very far. So it was towed to the study site by a surface ship. In this case, it's a vessel called the Carolyn Shoest. And it was towed by that ship on the surface out of the harbor. Then NR1 would submerge to 100 meters, and the surface ship would tow it at around 15 knots to the site of operations. Then NR1 from inside would release the shackle that was attached to the submarine, and NR1 would dive to the dive site. These guys in this Zodiac here are just people making sure the NR1 guys don't fall off the vessel. They're support. I'm not going to talk about all these operations that occurred in the 70s and later. I'm mainly going to talk about the ones that are outlined. Oh, sorry about that. I have to hit this back. I blew that. Now what?
From current slide. From current.
Yeah, I'll go back. I'll go back here. I'm sorry.
You want me to do something?
There. I'm only going to talk about 3 of them, and these are going to be the ones I'll talk about now. But before I do, a lot of what NR1 did had to do with setting up these bottom listening acoustic stations that listened for Russian submarines during the Cold War. These stations were early on called SOSUS stations. SOSUS, an acronym for Sound Surveillance System. And these were put on the seafloor and cabled to the continent or to the islands. And the cable would go into a little hut where the hut would record the acoustic sounds that the acoustic hydrophones were picking up from anything that was making noise in the ocean. And of course, whales were always recorded, as were submarines. The Russians during the Cold War, and I'm not sure today, always kept the submarine around Bermuda. And we used to call that, and when I was working for an anti-submarine warfare group, we used to call that Yankee Station after the type of submarine that was there, Russian Yankee, which was a nuclear ballistic submarine. And this submarine would stay there for 3 months, and then it would turn back and go through the straits here just south of Iceland into the Norwegian Sea back to Russia, and it would be relieved by another submarine. Well, these acoustic stations would pick up all that sound, and we could track the submarine using the SOSUS array, but I was also on an anti-submarine warfare group where we chased these submarines with sonobuoys launched by helicopters and aircraft. Nowadays, after the mid-1970s, the stations have been increased, and it's now, instead of SOSUS, called the IUSS. It's the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System. And as you can see, they've been expanded into the Pacific Ocean to look for Chinese and other type submarines. I could talk about that later if we have time. Here are my dives on NR1. This is way back, as I mentioned, half a lifetime ago. And first one was in 1972. I spent 6 days on the seafloor inside of a canyon off New England called Hydrographer Canyon. And then I was with a professor from Columbia named Bruce Hazen, who eventually died in NR1 in a heart attack in 1977 when he was working off Iceland on the undersea mid-Atlantic ridge. And they had to get him out of NR1 and bury him on Iceland. I also worked with Dr. Charlie Hollister, who was one of my thesis advisors at MIT. He was a great marine geologist who actually studied under Bruce Hazen at Columbia. And that was off North Puerto Rico on the continental shelf and slope. I spent 10 days crawling around the bottom with Charlie, and he's a very funny guy. I wish I had his humor. And then last one was 9 days off the Straits of Florida, between Florida and the Bahamas in 1974, with my buddy, Professor Wilf Gardner, who just retired from the oceanography program at Texas A&M. Wonderful guy. Wilf Gardner was Charlie Hollister's student. So there's a real hierarchy of scientists here. The basic objectives for the work I was doing were, first of all, to look at how the seafloor would, whether it could support these hydrophone arrays and cables that the U.S. wanted to put down. And the secondly was to determine the sediment types and the roughness features on the seafloor and whether the seafloor was stable, stable from a geological perspective, but also from a naval perspective about the things they wanted to do there. And then thirdly, my big interest was in near bed currents and the erodibility of the bed, and I went on to work on that in my career at the U.S. Geological Survey I'll talk about. So there's another picture of that beautiful map that was pioneered by Bruce Hazen and his colleague Marie Tharp. That shows this wonderful mid-Atlantic ridge. And I got to go back. Sorry about that. One more. Yeah.
Just talk from there.
Yeah, I'm going to talk to this. Yeah, can you do that for me? Yeah, I'm going to have my wife do it. I have a little tremor, so you had a back click? Back click, this right click, yeah. Okay, go previous there. There you go.
Right click
yep.
or left
click.
click?
Hit it, yep, click. Just click on the left click, yep.
Right.
Okay, this is Hydrographer Canyon, and there's a sidewall in the canyon. I seem to be hitting too many buttons.
Yeah. Why don't you just talk then?
Yeah, let me try it again. There we go. And we were operating in the top of Hydrographer Canyon down to about I would say about 2,500 feet. And on the bottom in the center of the canyon, we found a lot of these boulders. And the interesting thing about these boulders is they were undercut, what looked like by bottom currents that would scour around the boulders and leave big erosional depressions in that area. And as you can see, that boulder is about 2 meters to 2.5 meters across. We also found a lot of sediment ripples in the canyon. The sediment ripples indicating the activity of currents, and this is around 700 meters. Now, this is much deeper than surface waves could reach, and so these ripples are a little problematic. Well, it turns out that in my later work, I discovered that there are deep waves in the ocean called internal waves that can actually generate currents strong enough to move sand and silt like this and form these kinds of ripples and other types of bed forms in the ocean. The second dives I did were off Puerto Rico, as outlined by that red line here. We left the east side of Puerto Rico out of a naval base called Roosevelt Roads, and we went along the north shore of Puerto Rico, Charlie Hollister and I, crawling all the way around after 10 days of time and pulling into Mayaguez Harbor on the west side of Puerto Rico. That red line is basically the track we took across the Puerto Rican North Slope. We saw a lot of various kinds of animals and no plants, of course, that at these depths. And the animals here, I point out the coral, some of these unusual looking fan-like creatures called crinoids, and some deep sea sponges sitting on the bottom at around 400 meters depth on that north slope. There was also this funny looking spiny lobster that was hanging on to a hydroid that was attached to basically lava rock that was sitting on the north slope. And then in the Straits of Florida, and we were in the area outlined by this ellipse, the red ellipse, and that was between basically the coast of Florida and the Bahamas, a little north of Miami. We left from the Cape Canaveral and then did our work and then pulled into the harbor near Miami. We actually kind of cruised around in this area underneath the Gulf Stream. And the black, ugly looking line here is basically our route looking at the bottom. And this was in 1974, and I was with Wilf Gardner at this time. I put on a cable marking here because there are a lot of undersea cables here. And I didn't mention, I should have mentioned earlier that NR1 had wheels. It had 2 wheels that were in the free flooded compartment. And the captain could lower the wheels and we would roll along the bottom on the wheels, not powered through the wheels. They were powered through the screws, but the wheels gave the submarine stability on the bottom. And we would crawl around the bottom for miles and miles, looking at the bottom through the viewports. And right next to me here, I have a tape recording of a couple of comments I was making on the seafloor. I may not get a chance to use that. But in one instance, we actually, in this area, we snagged a cable in our wheels. And we had to figure out how to free up that cable. And the captain lifted NR1 off the bottom, returned to the bottom, lifted and returned, and that cable stayed hooked onto one of the wheels. The captain had the ability to jettison the wheels, but before he did that, he came to me and he said, "What do you think? Should we cut the cable?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if people like having their lights out in Miami," but the captain said, "You know, I'm not sure this is an active cable." And after a couple of times studying it on the TV camera, he put the arm out and cut it, saving the wheels. Well, the lights didn't go out in Miami. It turned out that cable was actually an abandoned cable on the seafloor. And I don't think the captain would have gotten his neck striped if that were a actual telecommunications cable or power cable. So cruising along the bottom in the Straits of Florida, we came along these very unusual features called bioherms. They're basically coral growths. This is deep water coral, and it's around maybe 700 meters deep. And there's all sorts of other animals attached to the coral here. And one interesting thing for a guy who worries about sediment transport like me is that these corals acted like a sediment fence, and they would capture the sediment as well as all sorts of organisms. And the sediment would build up into very elongate, large mounds on the bottom. And they would be quite interesting for the Navy because they had some unusual acoustic properties. And the Navy went back and did some studies of these effects of these mounds, these bioherms. But the geologists and biologists are still quite interested in studying these features. And of course, we always run into life besides coral on the bottom, the coral on the left here. And here's a large spiny lobster crawling around the bottom in about 860 meters depth. So that's my experiences on the bottom. Well, on that Straits of Florida cruise, we took aboard a guy that became a close friend of mine in the Navy. His name was Bob Ballard, that a lot of you might be familiar with because he does a lot of lecturing and gives shows on the Discovery Channel. And he was a retired naval officer and is an oceanographer like myself, educated at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in MIT. And he used NR1 afterward in 1995 and 6 in the Mediterranean. And he and NR1 discovered this bottom ship called the HMHS Britannic, which was a hospital ship during World War II. And it's the sister ship of the Titanic. It was the same design as the Titanic, same size, and it was sunk by a landmine, a sea mine in the Mediterranean, where Ballard then eventually found it, photographed it, and studied it. Ballard also, unfortunately, didn't invite me to go on this cruise where he was looking at Roman wrecks in the Mediterranean with NR1, and he discovered all these amphora and other types of Roman ruins on the bottom of the Mediterranean. It's quite a guy. So that's my talk about NR1, and I'm getting now where I have to get a little quicker. This is my talk about Alvin, where I used Alvin in 1975, as you'll see, to dive into a canyon off the East Coast. Here's some statistics about Alvin on the right. It's a submersible that can presently go down to 6,500 meters. When I used it, it only went down to 4,500. It didn't go very fast and because it was run by batteries and it just had one propeller. It traveled at 2 knots underwater, and it ranged only about 5 kilometers. And its endurance, limited by the oxygen, was 72 hours. And typically it operated just for 12 hours for safety, and it still does. It carried 3 people, a pilot and 2 scientists, and I'll talk a little more about what I did with it. Here's just a diagram of Alvin. It's an 8-foot sphere, and it carried 3 people, so things weren't very, you couldn't move around very easily. It had a single propeller, which acted as a rudder by turning the propeller. And it, of course, had a large arm and a basket and all sorts of cameras and lights for underwater work. These are the batteries and the electrical system. And these are variable ballast. These spheres are variable ballast tanks. So Alvin could get up and down from the bottom several times. Here's a more elaborate diagram. I'm not going to go into this. And you can see here is the sphere. In case of an emergency, Alvin could separate itself top and bottom, and the sphere would go up with the top flotation. the flotation is called syntactic foam on Alvin, and the syntactic foam would actually is a microspheres of glass and an epoxy resin that can take the great pressures of the ocean. The ocean pressure, 1 atmosphere in the ocean is every 10 meters. And this is a picture of Alvin, which a vehicle that it could control called external called Jason on a cable. And they used Jason to study the Titanic. And here's Alvin parked next to the Titanic in the Atlantic when Bob Ballard discovered the Titanic. And the picture is taken by Jason looking back at Alvin. This is Alvin on the ship that tends Alvin, called the Atlantis II, and it's operated out of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And Alvin is picked up by this big crane here and hoisted up and over the side and put into the water by this vessel. And there's the Atlantis II with Alvin in the water and a couple of divers that are helping it. Now, my cruise, I went down in Alvin in the deep water off New York City in the Hudson Submarine Canyon that leaves actually New York Harbor, cuts across the continental shelf into the deep water. And my dives went down to these 4 dives I meant. This is a drawing of the canyon that I made, and it's in fathoms. And so we went down to 10,000 to 13,000 feet in Alvin in 1975. I made the first dives to those depths in Alvin with 2 other scientists on this cruise. It was a pretty exciting time for submersibles. I started at the U.S. Geological Survey right after these dives. There I am, my mustache, standing on the deck of Alvin's tender ship called Lulu at the time. Alvin's in a little nest here, getting ready to be launched. It's in a cradle, and this is right above the Hudson Submarine Canyon in 1975. And there I am, right there, getting ready to get in with my scientist partner, Gil Rowe, who is a scientist at Texas A&M University. And there's the Alvin pilot standing next to me, getting ready to get in with no shirt on. And these are technicians. And on the bottom, I used the arm on Alvin to deploy a little device I made that had a syntactic foam top, a radiator hose, and a weight. And I squeezed it with the arm, and up popped dye pellets. And the dye pellets were used to measure the flow near the bottom at around 4,000 meters. I'm sorry, yeah, around 4,000 meters in the canyon. And unfortunately, we had a little visitor, this rat tail fish, and he came up and he really screwed up the dye streaks. We're able to measure the currents using these dye streaks. The first time the currents had been measured that deep in submarine canyons. We also deployed a current meter off the Lulu during the dive to 1,000 meters deep. And during the dive, a swordfish hit Alvin, and the score came up Alvin 1, swordfish 0. We got the swordfish back aboard, and that night we all had swordfish steaks. And my last dive was on this submersible in 1980, on a submersible called the Sea Cliff, which was a twin of Alvin. And these are the guys that helped me get into Sea Cliff. Made the first dive off Southern California, off Catalina, we went down around 1,000 meters. We got recalled to the surface on the underwater telephone because a storm came up, got to the surface and couldn't be recovered. We sat inside the submersible, 3 of us, for 6 hours, like sitting in a wash machine. And we finally had to be towed into the lee of Catalina Island, where we were finally put aboard the ship by the support vessel. I was never so sick in all my life. The captain asked me, how you feel? I said, do you think we're going to die? And he said, you're going to hope we do. And this is the last picture I'm going to show of a submersible, and that's Sea Cliff, taken by a diver underwater. This is a new submersible I never have gotten into, but it's the newest one that's now been down with 2 people in it to all of the deepest parts of the oceans, 5 of the deepest deeps, including the Challenger Deep at 36,000 feet. It's called the Limiting Factor. It's a privately owned submersible, and it's the newest thing on the blocks. It was built in 2018. I've never seen it, but I heard about it. Most of my career was spent doing this kind of stuff. We built these underwater bottom tripods that were instrumented, developed by me and my colleague, Dave Drake, to measure seafloor processes. And I've used these things in 75 different missions around the world, mostly off the U.S. West Coast and Hawaii. And there's one being deployed off Northern California. And with that, that's me, the handsome guy, not too long after my my MIT days and off Northern California. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to stop your sharing, and then I'm going to.
Did I hit something? Leave?
Nope.
No. Okay. I'll just stay here.
They're all on mute.
Sorry about the slide shaking. I have a little tremor.
Don't worry about it.
So, do we have questions? You can use the participant and raise your hand. And
It's
Steve Gottlieb.
I was a little surprised by the shape of these things. I always assumed that the submersibles were spheres, at least externally, to handle all the pressures. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, they're basically, you're right, Steve. A lot of them are spheres, just spheres. And those are usually called bath escapes. And the difference basically between these submersibles I was talking about and the bath escape is the submersible can repeatedly move up and down from the bottom. The bath escape, once it hits the bottom, it's there, and then it drops its weight and up it comes. The submersible has the ability to have variable ballast that can move itself up and down from the bottom and then travel horizontally. And basically, that's the difference between those spherical bath escapes and the submersible. The original bath escape that went to 36,000 feet in the Challenger Deep was in 1964, and that was done by Jacques Piccard and with a Navy officer, Don Walsh, on board. That was the deepest dive up until recently, in 1964, in a bath escape. Yes, called a Trieste.
Mac Odell.
Yeah, just fascinating. But you said that these submersibles you were on went down as far as 12,500 feet with crew of 3 aboard. Did I read that right?
Yeah, that's the Elbin. That's the Elbin, yes.
Now, isn't that about the same depth as the disastrous submersible that went down for the Titanic?
Yes, that's right. And I'd like to just comment about that, Mike. Malcolm, is that okay?
Please.
Yeah, okay. As you probably all have heard, that the blame for this disaster on the Titan submarine was the fact that it was made out of 2 different materials. One of the materials that formed the bow of that submersible, the Titan, it was made out of titanium. The major part of the submersible in which the people sat was made out of a special steel called a carbon fiber steel. And unfortunately, that carbon fiber material wasn't pressure tested repeatedly for repeated high pressures. And a lot of those of us that have been diving in these things feel that because it wasn't repeatedly tested for high pressure, its failure happened after the 5th dive to that depth. and that maybe that the carbon fiber pulled apart during that dive. Now, another interesting thing you may not know is the Navy undersea listening stations picked up that implosion of that submersible. They were the first ones that heard that disaster. The SOSUS, old SOSUS array, now IUSS, picked up that implosion and reported it.
So your submersibles would have been a whole hell of a lot safer and been able to do the same kind of research without the risks.
Yeah, the Alvin, of course, visited the Titanic with Bob Ballard when he discovered it. And they used that remote vehicle off the Titanic to go inside the Titanic. And you may have seen those videos of that vehicle called Jason moving around inside the Titanic. If you haven't, you ought to look those up online. They're pretty amazing. Yes, the Alvin could repeatedly go up and down. Yes.
What would we look for to find those?
I would look under, I would first of all research Robert Ballard online, and maybe Robert Ballard and Titanic on Google or Safari, whatever. Yeah. Yep.
Do I see anybody else who want? Michael Holt.
Dave.
Yeah. Hi, Mike.
I'm curious about why you were curious about movement on the bottom. You said you were interested in sediment transfer and waves on the bottom. Why is that important to study?
Yeah, well, a lot of it has to do with putting down structures on the seafloor and the erosion caused by waves and currents, and a lot of it, and we want to understand whether these things that are attached to the ocean floor are going to be safe down there because of that. But a lot of it, apart from scientific curiosity and trying to understand how the Earth works, it has to do with the Navy wanting to know how to operate on the ocean floor and where it might be safe and not safe. Incidentally, these submarine canyons that this might be a little digression, but the submarine canyons provide excellent hiding spots for submarines. When a submarine goes into a submarine canyon, the sound gets pretty hard to pick up and figure out where it's coming from. Yeah, Mike. So I studied erosion pretty much of the ocean floor in different places pretty much throughout my career, and a lot of it was done for. It was originally done for the oil development offshore and putting down oil rigs and things like that on the offshore. When we declared Project Independence way back in our early days, and Reagan and Nixon, we tried to drill a lot more in the offshore areas, particularly off Alaska, and a lot of the interest was in the safety of the rigs on the ocean floor. Yeah.
Thanks. Great talk. Thanks.
Larry Riddle had a question, and then Victoria and Barry.
Yep. There.
We can't hear you, Larry.
Larry.
No, we're getting a squeaky voice.
Sounds like me underwater.
I'm gonna move to Victoria, and we'll come back to you. Would you mute, Victoria?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much. This was a terrific talk. I have a serious question and one not so serious. You had that cable that you were tied, it got tangled in your wheels. It brings up the question of security of these cables and what the kind of damage they could happen if an enemy were to cut an important cable. So is there a security program going on to protect these underground cables? My second is just, I loved all those Roman artifacts that were found. Were you able to get any of those and keep them?
To answer the second one, I've asked Ballard to send me one, but he hasn't done that yet. He and I actually worked together quite a bit in the Navy. When I was a Navy officer, we both worked at the Office of Naval Research at the same time. And then, of course, he became famous, and I just became one of those guys living on the West Coast. And as far as the cable's concerned, the answer is that, we have many cables that transect the entire ocean basin, and there's not a whole lot of security paid to those cables, and we still use a lot of them. They're still active, but thanks to satellites, satellite communications have sort of taken over from the cables largely. But there are still some cables in different parts of the ocean floor, like in the islands off the Western Pacific and islands in the North Atlantic, that still people send communications messages through. So the answer is they're not very secure. It's a lot of things for the Navy to worry about. That's about my answer. Yeah.
Barry?
Yes, I have two questions. I wonder, having just finished listening to the audible book of Dan Brown's latest novel, which has a lot to do with underwater activity, how accurate is the underwater sonar and up to what distance? That would be my first question. The other one's more frivolous, and that is there anything unique about the Bermuda Triangle, given all the folklore about Bermuda?
Well, as far as the sonars go, I left it a while ago, but these sonars that the Navy has, they now have much greater range than when I was back there using them. They're more like the Hunt for Red October. You remember that show? They certainly can see out there many tens of miles, and with these sonars, and these are active sonars, meaning they actually ping, 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 and then they receive that information back from the ping when it reflects off of an undersea rock or mountain. And the ones that are really highly accurate and used for navigation, like the one I mentioned on NR1, those things can actually see a Coke can on the bottom, but they have a limited range of maybe a mile or two. I can't remember what it was on NR1. I think it was 2 miles. But they're pretty accurate. Now, the other thing I didn't mention was there's a lot of use now of underwater video and on these research submarines, but even some Navy vehicles and unmanned vehicles that the Navy has, the underwater unmanned vehicles. And these videos are pretty important these days, and I think we're going to hear more and more about the use of video in the ocean. I don't remember what else you asked me about. Dan Brown. I haven't read
about the Bermuda Triangle.
Oh, the Bermuda Triangle. Yeah,
the configuration of the seabed in that area.
The only experience I've had in the Bermuda Triangle has been that when I went on research cruises there, there's a lot of sargassum. A lot of the seaweed and the materials that collect in the ocean, and the large blankets of this material cover a good part of that area off Bermuda, in the Bermuda Triangle. And on that seaweed and on that sargassum, you may have seen on television on some shows that all sorts of organisms live there. Even birds use it as sort of nesting areas. And so the sargassum, the seaweed that covers large parts of at least that Bermuda Triangle area, provide sort of a planet for other organisms to live. Now, of course, there's the old idea that the seaweed captured the vessel, the Flying Dutchman, and sort of it disappeared, kind of hung up in this area. I don't know much about that. Yeah.
I saw Bruce Partridge a minute ago, and then he took down his hand. Bruce, are you there?
I was going to ask about the Hunt for Red October. And before I ask the question, congratulate you on a wonderful talk.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
So, any professional views of the submarines getting within about 5 feet of each other? or bouncing off the walls of the canyon.
Yeah, and now I just want to say about submarine activity. Before I did my NR-1 dives, I was a Navy officer. When I did the dives, I was a lieutenant commander. Before that, I was a lieutenant on an anti-submarine warfare group operated out of Quonset Point, Rhode Island. I was on the USS Wath, and I was the admiral's oceanographer, sort of pet oceanographer. And I was the guy planning the sonobuoy field as we tracked the Russian submarine from Bermuda up to almost Murmansk Harbor in Russia. And the admiral had to get called off on the red phone by the admiral who ran the submarine warfare in the Atlantic. We tracked this submarine that was fully evasive all the way up there. And we had two submarines working with our anti-submarine warfare group. They were U.S. nuclear attack submarines, one of them called the Bluefish. And the Bluefish and this Russian Yankee submarine that was heading home but very evasive, they came very close to one another, as I found out eventually. So there's been a lot of incidents recently about, you hear about air collisions and Russian and Chinese and U.S. aircraft. Well, there's a lot of near misses in the ocean between submarines, the Russian, Chinese who have a really large submarine fleet, and the U.S. submarines. I only hear about that anecdotally from my Navy buddies who I talk to once in a while, but I do know that happens. Yes.
Just a little frightening.
Yeah, it is a little frightening, and it wouldn't take much to have a little collision like that. On the anti-submarine warfare, when we were chasing that Russian, those of us on the admiral's staff were quite worried about this idea that we're heading to Murmansk, and we were being overflown by bare Russian aircraft. And we were worried on the staff, and we talked to the admiral about it, and he wasn't very worried about it. But he eventually got called off. And just before that happened, I had seen the movie, The Bedford Incident. Anybody remember that movie with Richard Widmark? If you haven't seen it, get it on Netflix. It's a wonderful movie to watch about the near atomic warfare.
Robert Burkhart.
Dave, thanks so much. That was a wonderful and a very engrossing delivery. Really appreciated it.
Thanks, Bob.
As you look ahead the next 10, 15, 20 years in oceanography, are there some big unanswered questions that we may find answers to?
Yes. One is how to get more energy out of the ocean so we can use it for human use. There have been many ideas about putting offshore wind machines and other types of devices to take advantage of the energy in the winds offshore and also in the surface wave. There are surface wave energy creating devices that are now being tested off Oregon by the U.S. government in cooperation with a few universities like Oregon State. I worked on these interesting waves in the ocean that I think are totally unexploited. They're called internal waves. Most of you may know about them, but these are waves you don't see and feel. Unless some of you divers who've been diving down to 100 feet in seasonal thermoclines may know that you get moved up and down by these waves inside the ocean. But I'm talking about large internal tidal waves that are generated by the tides when the tidal currents move over undersea mountains and ridges and things like that. And these tides they move around all over the oceans, and they have been totally underlooked in the possibility of getting some more energy out, I think. So I think there are some people working on this, and they're largely in Europe. The U.S. has a few scientists working on it, but the Europeans are working pretty hard on this internal tidal energy. That's one thing you may hear about in the future.
Wes Johnson. Unmute.
Hey, Wes. Wherever you are.
I've got two questions.
Hi,
and
Wes.
the first one is, of course, you're aware of Blind Man's Bluff, the book.
Yeah.
And second, I have a friend here who has built submarines who has a question for you.
Okay. Yeah, I hope it's not too difficult.
Oh, hi, Dave. Great talk. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My name's Peter Green, and I was I built the last 9 Trident submarines from an electric boat. But Dugan
boy.
Shipway was executive officer on NR1, and I didn't know if you ran into him, but he was a terrific guy and a great friend of mine. And I just wondered if you had a personal experience with Dugan. He went on to become an admiral and also did great things in the in building ships also.
Yeah, what was his full name? What was his name?
He went by Dugan Shipway.
Oh yeah, I met him. I didn't dive with Dugan, but he was close friends with the captain of NR1 that I served with when I was doing my dives, and that his name was Toby Warthen. You might mention that.
Okay.
And Toby, I think, introduced me to Dugan when we were in Groton, Connecticut.
Yes. Yeah. Well, again, thank you. Great talk.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks.
It was very enjoyable.
Yeah, it did. I hope most people have probably not heard of NR1 because it was a totally secret submarine, and I couldn't publish scientific papers until NR1 was decommissioned in 2009. They kept they kept it totally secret.
Eric came back to visit me last year in Groton, and they've preserved the sail from the NR1 and the grappling device, and it's there for exhibit
at the museum.
And
yes.
And the story to go with it.
With the Nautilus.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm glad they added. I just added that myself. I'm glad to hear that. But I haven't been back there, but I'm planning to go see that NR1 exhibit. I hear it's really a nice one to visit. Yeah.
Bill Bond?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Bill.
Dave, you've come a long way from San Diego when we were young officers.
Yeah, you remember that, Bill. You were in that other Navy service, the Marines.
Right. Dave, what kind of training did guys have to go down in those submersibles? I mean, you couldn't have hangups about claustrophobia. Did you guys get trained a lot for that kind of work?
We had to answer a question, are you claustrophobic? And I just put no. And you did have to do a couple things. We had to actually put on snorkel gear and see if we could handle and scuba gear and see if we could handle having that on our faces when we were in a pool and underwater. But we weren't really tested, and I don't. The guys who operated NR1, as I mentioned, were all nuclear power trained, and they were all submariners, so they were all taken care of. But the ones who operate these various submersibles, like the guy who had the one that imploded, you all know he was a Princeton guy, probably, right? Yeah, Princeton graduate. He had special training, but I don't think many others get much special training other than the pilots. They go through a course at Woods Hole Oceanographic and at Scripps Institute of Oceanography to train for becoming submersible pilots. They do have a training program. Yeah.
What an amazing career you've had.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I told my wife who's sitting there, I said I wouldn't trade it for anything, and she said the fact that I survived, she's quite happy. Yeah.
Larry Riddle, want to try again?
Yeah, I apologize for the chipmunk effects there.
Oh, no problem.
The first map you showed, undersea map, had what to me was a surprising feature on Greenland that made it look as if the a large part of the northwestern part of the Greenland island was in fact underwater. Is that correct, or just no?
No, I think it was just the way that appeared. No,
Okay.
now I could comment and maybe give another talk on global climate problem,
Yeah.
but that's a separate issue. No, I that was just an artifact of that map.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
David, you mentioned Iceland, and it was quite clear to me. We just came back from there, and it was quite clear that the ridge runs right through Iceland, and obviously is volcanic activity on that ridge. You said something about you would want to make a comment about that. What do you want
Yes.
to tell us about Iceland?
You know, what I'd like to say is I think everyone here should go visit Iceland if they want to see the ocean floor. I mean, it is truly part of that mid-oceanic ridge in the Atlantic, where, and as most of you know, the new crust of the Earth is forming in those in the Rift Valley that's at the top of that oceanic ridge. The material from the mantle beneath the crust is coming up in volcanic vents, and it's forming new crust. And the formation of that new crust in Iceland included is sort of separating there and pushing that particular plate either away from the ridge, and that plate that's pushing away from the ridge actually moves the continents. It moves the continents. North America goes westward because of that formation at the ridge. And that material, you might ask me, well, how fast is that happening? Well, you know, in California, you know about fast action, but the North Atlantic plate, where the North Atlantic sits, is part of the Western North Atlantic Ocean, is attached to North America. And that whole thing's moving at a centimeter or two a year on average. And every now and then it might move a little faster when you have a large earthquake that's caused by the subduction type earthquake. But yeah, so it's happening in our lifetimes. And if you want to see it happening, go to Iceland. It's a good spot.
I second that.
Yeah.
Lester, unmute.
Hi, Les.
Am I unmuted?
No, you're good.
Okay, Dave, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Les.
You mentioned your conference with Admiral Rickover as being difficult. Could you tell us a little more about that? And then I
was hoping no one would ask me that question. I still have mental scars from that one.
I also am curious, on the conning tower of the Nerwin, there was a doghouse. What was that exactly?
They call it the doghouse because maybe one of the guys had a dog that he kept in there. But the doghouse was really a place that's in NR1 in Nerwin. It had two hatches, one at the very top of the conning tower and one right on the submersible pressure hull. And they often didn't like to have both of them open at the same time. You know, you would open one and then get into the conning tower, either from going in or coming out, and the other one would be closed, and they would say, "You're in the doghouse."
Okay.
That was the expression they used. Yeah, and about Admiral Rickover, maybe a brilliant person, but when I got called, he called me to his office, and I went in Arlington, Virginia, and he was sitting in his office there near the Naval Office of Naval Research, where I actually was assigned at the time in Boston. I went in. A captain met me, a four-striper, and I'm at that time a lieutenant, and of course saluted the captain. And as most of you know, and if you were in the Navy, we didn't salute when we didn't have our cap on. Normally we just said hello, but I saluted, and he brought me in and he told me to salute Admiral Rickover when we went in. So I saluted Admiral Rickover, and he just looked up at me. He said, "Sit down." And so I sat down, and it wasn't a three-legged chair like I've heard some stories about, but it wasn't a very comfortable chair. It was actually a stool, and I sat there and he looked at me for, I would say for about 2 minutes and never said a word, just sat there looking at me. And I know I have a large nose, and I kept thinking, you know, there's something about my nose that he didn't like. But he looked at me and he said, "Have you heard of NR1?" And I said, "Admiral, I have not." And he said, "Well, it's a submarine I would like to see some science done on. And if you're interested, I'd like you to participate in this." And I really got excited about it. And I said, "You know, I've never been in a submarine like that, and I had been in a submarine, but not in anything like that." And he said, "I want to ask you a few questions." Then he proceeded to ask me about my mother. And I still remember that. And he said, "Your mother wasn't a U.S. citizen." And I said, I know that, Admiral. She came from Italy when she was 1 year old." And he said, "How did you ever become a Navy officer?" I said, "Well, I called her when I found that out when I was at Princeton. And I said, 'Mom, you have to be a citizen.' She said, 'I am a citizen. I'm married to your father.' And I said, 'That doesn't count. You were born in Italy, so I heard. And you have to go become a citizen.' And so she went to the local congressman, a U.S. congressman who was an Italian guy from our neighborhood. And the congressman introduced him to a federal judge, and they made her a citizen after a first meeting. When she answered the question, who was the first president of the United States, she said Washington. They told her she's a citizen. And I recounted this story to Admiral Rickel. And he said, "You're hired." And it's a true story. And I was at Princeton, the draft board was beating on me, and I decided I better apply to Naval Officer School. And me, C.B. Moya, John Newsom, and Jim Donahue all applied to Naval Officer School, and we all went together. News didn't make it because he had a heart problem, a defect, and the three of us made it. And Donahue, Moya, and I became Navy officers in that December of '62 class. Yeah, I had never been on a Navy ship, and the Navy still didn't believe that I was my mother is a citizen.
Dave, I don't know what year that happened, what year your parents married. My parents married in 1922. And there was a period of 3 months when that was automatic citizenship.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And which my mother did become a citizen. She was here from the age of 8, but did become a citizen by virtue of marrying my dad. There are funny stories that come from that too, but I won't bore you with them.
Yeah, and I should tell everyone that I just wrote a book about growing up in my Italian neighborhood. And it's not published yet, but I've given it out to a bunch of friends. And I think Bill Carr, if he's still around, he has a copy. Bill's the only one of our classmates that lives near me. And so Bill and I have really entered a long-lasting friendship and talk a lot about these things. And Bill still sings Mustang Sally and when we have dinner.
Right. Mac, you'll get the last question.
Okay, you know, I was fascinated by the Titanic and the submersibles, but the one that really interests me more than anything is Shackleton. That's the greatest adventure story ever happened. And the Endurance, they've gone down with submersibles and taken pictures, but has nobody gone down with one of your super submersibles where they can actually go inside and look at this incredible wreck with this incredible story behind it?
You know, that's a quite interesting question, and I know a little bit of. I've read the book. I know about that, and Alvin can certainly do it because Alvin can take on this Jason, which is a remote vehicle that they could use to explore the inside of the the sunken ship. And they did that on the Titanic, of course. And I don't think this new submersible limiting factor could operate a research a submersible vehicle outside the submersible. but a limiting factor certainly could get there, but I haven't heard anything about it going there.
Yeah, it's only 12,000 feet, the same as Titanic.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And to me, it's much more interesting.
Yeah, Bob Ballard, who's no longer active in these deep dives, he did a couple of deep dives on other vessels. The Maine, remember the Maine, and he also the Britannic, of course, and then all these Roman wrecks, and a couple of other famous Spanish ships. I think one of them was the ship that Vasco da Gama used in his famous voyage around Africa. Yeah.
Well, there's no adventure story like Shackleton. To me, that's the ultimate.
It is a great book and story. Yes.
What a story. 28 men, 2 years, all lost. Nobody thought they'd ever survive, and every last one of them survived.
Yes. I don't. Is there a movie about that?
There's a documentary.
Yeah.
The photographer took a lot of pictures, and a lot of the pictures were saved. But how he managed to keep those guys alive and finally get them rescued after when he finally came into the whaling station on Georgia Island, was it? Oh no, on Elephant Island. The head of the whaling station almost fell over. He said, "My God, we thought you were dead 2 years ago."
Oh, yeah.
Dave, thank you.
All right.
This has been a terrific program, and
thank you.
We really appreciate it. And I'm particularly appreciative because you stepped in to help me very quickly, and I appreciate it. Just for those of you who are interested in film, I recommend a movie called Greyhound.
Great movie.
Greyhound, and it ties to the show because it's an anti-U-boat picture with Tom Hanks, available on Apple TV. Just to reinforce what's going to happen further in this semester, next month, October 10th, you have to mark your calendars now. I want to make sure there's no ambiguity. It's going to be at 3 o'clock instead of 4 Eastern, because our speaker is Dick Jackson, who will be speaking from Greece, where it will be very late at night. And he and I compromised on 3 o'clock instead of 4. He lives in Greece after a career in diplomacy. He became president of a university. I think he's got a lot of stories to tell us. November 14th, we have Perry Neubauer, who's going to talk about his life in architecture. And on December 12th, we have Yaroslav Folda, who Perry tells me was known as Jerry in college. And he's a medieval art historian, and is going to talk to us about the Book of Kells, which, if you've ever been to London, you probably saw with a bunch of other people. But he's going to have a richly pictorial presentation of that. So we'll look forward to seeing everybody October 10th at 3 o'clock.
And remember our classmate, John Ogden, please, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. And now I'm going to end the meeting. Thanks to all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.